Welcome back, everyone. And we're starting off with I can't even explain this. Narrative fail. Now, media warning us that unplanned movie will lead to terrorism. The left has done some pretty outrageous things in order to hinder the success of the recently released Unplanned movie surrounding the true story of Abby Johnson's transformation from a Planned Parenthood director to a pro life activist after witnessing an abortion at 13 weeks. The latest and possibly laziest attempt is attempting to convince people that the movie may result in terrorism. Writing for The Cut, Caitlin Muscatello penned an article titled Unplanned is a movie that could get someone killed. Ironic that it is actually opposing killing of the unborn. Wherein Muscatello attempts to reason that the movie may lead some to radicalize against the abortion industry, which may lead to deadly violence. Of course, you can see the tweet here. Muscatello first attempts to paint anti-abortion protesters who pray in front of abortion clinics as, and I'm not kidding, sanitized harassment. This after attempting to tell its audiences that an abortion wouldn't bother a fetus since it doesn't feel pain until its 24th week of gestation. Muscatello's facts are out of date, and while it's still unclear what a baby feels at 13 weeks, we now know it can begin feeling pain as early as 15. After sneering in type at the movie some more with social justice-laden sexism and racism in tow, Muscatello finally gets around to making her point. The movie gets its message across well, in fact, maybe too well. As a result, people may be taken in by the movie and resort to terrorism. Muscatello points to a scene involving the off-screen death of abortionist George Tiller, who was shot and killed by an anti-abortion radical, and attempts to sell the reader that the movie could create more killers thanks to messaging from far-right-leaning figures like Rush Limbaugh or Bill O'Reilly, which she blames for any violence against abortionists. It is films like Unplanned that could get more people killed, wrote Muscatello. Tiller notes there are hundreds of Planned Parenthood locations, but it only takes one of the hundreds of thousands who have watched Unplanned to do violence. There are currently 357 Planned Parenthood health centers that provide abortions in the U.S., and already hundreds of thousands of people have viewed Unplanned, wrote Muscatello. It would only take one of them to create a real-life tragedy, unlike the tragedy of thousands and thousands of abortions murdering the unborn. More since Roe versus Wade, since I believe any war in history. Muscatello then noted her time at the theater watching the movie herself alongside those who came to see the movie due to their agreement with the message. She notes that a woman nodding along to the message of the film and one man raising his hands in the air near the end, a typical Christian sign of worship and prayer, gave her a feeling that she was witnessing something scary, and then proceeded to notice how normal everyone looked when the lights came on. Toward the end of Unplanned, Johnson's characters tells members of the coalition that in her 8 years at Planned Parenthood, she had seen lots of women drive away when they saw protesters praying outside the clinic. It works, she says to the other characters, but really the audience. The message is a subtle form of an infomercial. Take to the clinics. It works. In the theater I was in, a woman with white hair nodded, and a man in the third row raised his arms up to the ceiling. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was witnessing something scary. Then the lights came on and everyone looked perfectly nice. This is astounding bigotry on Muscatello's part, and painting normal, everyday Americans as dangerous because they agreed with a film that killing babies is bad. Says a lot more about her than it does the movie, right-leaning opinion, or the pro-life movement. If she wants to see radicalization as a result of propaganda, then I can point to a boatload of left-leaning criminals who engaged in violence both in the past and in the present that Muscatello would likely not like to answer for, or at least make excuses about. Perhaps she would like to discuss the multitude of shooters who are registered Democrats or the consistent violence of Antifa. I wonder if Muscatello's concerns for violence causing propaganda extends to Democrat politicians encouraging literal confrontation in the streets, which their supporters did, by the way. In fact, some people can't step outside wearing a Make America Great Again hat without running into assault or threat of some form. Going through Muscatello's articles on The Cut, I'm not seeing much from her addressing these things, and I doubt I ever will. It's a fairly simple fact of modern society. Liberals will ignore violence from their own and will invent threats of violence where they do not exist. I have not read of, I believe it was the Tillers. Not sure if I remember that name right. Uh, let's see here. George Tiller. Sorry about that. Should have remembered that. I haven't read about that in a long time. I read about it when it happened. I know my parents discussed it. And I read about it in other venues since, other times I've read. But if you go back and look, the murderer was not indicative of the pro-life movement. When you tell people that seeing pro-lifers praying is harassment, you are advocating for the removal of the First Amendment protection of the right of freedom of religion, not freedom from religion. It's a bit of semantics the liberal side of politics never wants to discuss. They don't address Islam because, of course, if they addressed Islam as it should be addressed, as having the propensity to create the most radicalized people on the planet, they might actually face danger. So they turn their ire on Christians who pray for those we feel need prayer, who speak out and will happily tell you why I believe something is wrong. But in my 42 almost years of life, I can actually remember about 35 of them. 36. I do remember first grade vaguely, but I do remember more than that. I can remember going to church, going out for dinner with family friends from church or from my parents' lives. And of them, I would say 90 to 95% of them are very pro life, as much as my mother, my father, myself. And my father and I would be the first to rush into a crowd to save someone who is so called pro choice, what we call pro abortion, from a threat. My father served in the military. I have been a firefighter and law enforcement. Violence is never the answer for us. Yes, I make the statement that there are times when violence is the question, and the only answer you're able to give is yes. And the only time that is for me is when I see someone threatened with physical violence. I must respond to stop that violence, and sometimes that requires a bit from me. If I see someone in danger of losing their life, I will use violence to end that threat. That is the only time violence is tolerable for me. I don't watch boxing, MMA. I used to watch the WWE and it got tiresome. I'm not one of these people who enjoys watching people pummel each other. Rather, I took martial arts in my youth and I'm considering going back because the style I took was what I call the Mr. Miyagi School of Martial Arts. It's not good to fight, someone always gets hurt. And the tack onto that is normally everyone does. So, having said that, I want Miss Muscatello to explain how she justifies calling millions upon millions of people the world over who firmly believe that life begins at conception and that abortion is murder, terrorists, is right. You see, look back just almost 3 years to when conservatives, during the run up to 2016, were beginning to be called things like deplorables or worse. Look to the campus of UC Berkeley, where a group invited a speaker to their private event, and the group that invited that speaker to said private event had members of the group assaulted by people who wanted to censor the group. Their message was, you invited someone to a meeting we're not welcome at that we don't like, so we will beat you up. Look to the inauguration of Donald Trump. Rather than what Miss Muscatello describes as harassment, that being prayer, we saw actual rioting, businesses vandalized or worse, cars overturned, set on fire, people assaulted in the street because they couldn't demand the country just overturn an election. Look to Maxine Waters, who quite literally said, "Get in their faces, push back, let them know they're not welcome anywhere." Or Mr. Eric Holder, "When they go low, we kick them." Hillary Clinton, "We'll be civil after we win." You see, the violence, the threats of violence, and worse, tends to come from liberals. The man who shot Steve Scalise, Bernie Sanders supporter. The others that we've seen, even the so-called MAGA shooter who had a van that was in pristine condition with stickers that had not begun to fade. Anyone who's had a car in their teens knows that stickers fade really fast. And having them lined up so perfectly, no one does that. You do that in a montage board that you're going to use for advertisement or as art. You don't do that on your car windows. Those stickers, if you ask me, were specifically purchased for their size to black out the window. They were lined up perfectly. That is a man who is planning something and planning to make sure those stickers send a message. Or it may have been someone who found a van they could use to perpetuate a message they wished to perpetuate. Notice how quick that story went dark. Notice how fast everyone in the media quit talking about that man. Notice how fast that van vanished. It was a message that they wanted to perpetuate in the media. Once it had run its course, and of course those few days it ran, everything else was ignored, the story goes away. It's the same thing with this. Someone wants to control the narrative. They wish to push that abortion is just healthcare and opposing it is violence. I've said this many times and I'll continue saying it because every time I've read 1984, the words thought crime stick in my head. The words Big Brother is watching you stick in my head. And that's exactly what we're seeing the run up to in the media today. You're not allowed to even think something that the left says is wrong. You're not allowed to do or say anything that they do not approve of, and they are watching you. Stories like this actually tend to almost radicalize Miss Muscatello's followers and fans, because in the days following this, I will be willing to bet that we will have readers that read this and are fans of Miss Muscatello who will be reporting their neighbors or co-workers for, I think they're going to do something at an abortion clinic because they were seen reading a Bible or praying over their meal. This is an assault on freedom of thought, freedom of belief. If the tables were completely turned, let's go back 50 years before Roe v. Wade. And let's say there was a movie called Unplanned, chronicling the story of a young doctor who wished to help young women whose pregnancies were unplanned, and these clinics were seen as needed, but they were illegal. And someone said this movie will radicalize the people who support abortion, and it should be censored, and we need to watch these pro-choicers. Imagine if that movie were put out today, depicting the so-called pro-choice, again I call them pro-abortion, crowd as being radicalized by a movie. How quickly would that movie be yanked from theaters? How quickly would the media be completely silent about it? It would just vanish. Thankfully, Unplanned was not pulled. The makers did not bow to the pressure, and the message is being spread. There are multiple doctors who have said that the whole 24th week thing is a myth. There are doctors who have stated that there is never been, and they have cited evidence of this, a case where abortion was necessary to save the mother's life. I've made the statement multiple times that if a woman's doctor, okay, this is an OBGYN or just a general practitioner or any other physician she is under the care of, states, you will die and your baby will die. Or I can remove the baby, which means it will die, but you will live. If that doctor states those are the two options, I'm not involved in that decision. the parents of that child, the woman laying on the table being told this by her doctor, that's the person who makes that choice. That will not happen in a Planned Parenthood clinic. That will happen in an obstetric gynecologist's office or in a hospital. And it should be something that only the medical doctor and the patient have any say in. But again, note, there are multiple OBGYNs and medical doctors and other medical professionals who've said that never happens. So because of all this, we get Miss Muscatello telling us that Unplanned is going to radicalize the pro-choice movement and prompt us to pray and lift our hands and nod our heads in agreement. Do you see anything wrong with that? Because if you don't, you should. But I've talked long enough about this. Let me know what you think. Just remember, keep the comments civil. We only learn from debate. We do not learn from arguments. Make sure also to like and share the video, and please remember to subscribe and activate notifications. Until next time, everyone have a wonderful day.